This is Bharat's World, a space at the print where you will hear India's foreign policy point of view, what makes India special, not just what makes India special, but what is India's point of view in terms of its foreign policy. And today we're talking about the just concluded G20 summit, in which, of course, India hit the ball out of the park by bringing all parties together on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That consensus was reached. But before I go any further, I'd like to introduce my panelists today. And I'm connecting the time zones with Asha Jadeja Motwani in New York. She's a venture capitalist in the US and the founder of the Motwani Institute for Thought Leadership and Innovation. And right here in New Delhi with me is Dr. Swasti Rao, an associate fellow with the Europe and Eurasia Center at the Manohar Parikh Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, an autonomous think tank under India's Ministry of Defense. So welcome, ladies. Welcome to Bharat's World at the print. And thank you for joining me in this debate.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Ms. Jadeja Motwani, can I come to you first? In the US, Joe Biden, the US president, was in Delhi, of course, a big visit for India and the US, bilaterals on the eve of the G20 summit. But the fact that there was actually a consensus on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that paragraph 3 in the Bali Declaration that was so contested that over the last whole year, over the last 11 months or so, not one meeting has come to any consensus. But India managed to break that deadlock and to bring all sides together. So how are the Americans looking at it?
They are right now. I mean, if you look at, the comments from Jake Sullivan or from Anthony Blinken and so on, you'll see that they are over the moon about this whole thing. The reason is that everybody right now wants the war to end. On the Biden side, they would prefer it if the war ended after November, after the elections, because the war will definitely benefit Biden's re-election. I personally am unsupportive of of this whole notion of war and re-elections. But that's an unfortunate truth in U.S. politics. But that said, everybody here in Washington D.C. wants the war to end. On India's side, of course, everybody, even the Russians, desperately want to get out. But there was no face-saving mechanism that the Bali Declaration had. India has created and put in place a blueprint that will allow face-saving for both Russia and Ukraine to get out of this mess and move forward, because it's affecting the whole world. It's affecting our economy. It's affecting our currencies, and there is uncertainty in the market right now. So right. Everybody wants it to end. So I think for India, it was a total feather in the cap because they managed to get this done with the right language.
So this feather in the cap of both Prime Minister Modi and India has been described by such a wide variety of Indians. Anand Mahindra, the businessman, has called Amitabh Kant, who was India's Sherpa, and he says he's AK-87, a weapon of mass diplomacy. I mean, that's quite fascinating. But what I was really struck by is Shah Rukh Khan, the Shah Rukh Khan, SRK. He himself has tweeted in favor of the G20, and he says, this is the success of India's G20 presidency and for fostering unity between nations for a better future for the people of the world. I mean, if SRK, whose Jawan, whose movie has opened this week, last week, actually, a few days ago, if he can talk about the G20, then you can imagine that it's this word or this phrase is on every Indian's lips. So Dr. Swasti Rao, you're one of India's foremost analysts, foreign policy analysts. What's your take, not just on Shah Rukh Khan, but what happened this week?
Right. First of all, thanks for having me with you. And it's great to share this space with Asha ji. About what do I have to say about India's, this high, so to say, voltage performance at the global stage? I think, yes, truly. I mean, if I had to sort of phrase the thing that I've been saying for the last few days and writing, I would say it's a true celebration of India's intersectional global movement, because you saw that India cemented its position as a fulcrum between the East and the West on the Ukraine issue. India has, of course, we've been talking about it, but then we really saw that India had this ability to exploit the unique geographical position in the Indo-Pacific with the unique moment in geopolitics where the world is divided, but it still looking for ways to work out convergences. And of course, it also speaks volumes of India's rise as a trustworthy partner for everybody, that matters in the world today. India really came out as a champion of the global south, because if you remember, there was a summit that Prime Minister Modi had conducted before he took over the presidency,
Right.
or I think in the early days of the presidency. And what we saw happening in New Delhi was that that got translated from rhetoric to reality, with the African Union joining. And of course, I think the biggest thing out here that everybody's talking about is the IMEC, or the IMEC, whichever way you'd like to call it, because that is supposed
That's
to be
the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor. Okay.
Yes, so it's supposed to be a game changer. Well, I would probably have a few words of caution out there as to how much of a game changing can it do. But yes, it has all ingredients in the right place, at least. So I'm sure in the course of our discussion, we will talk about the problems as well. But I think all in all, I think it's been a 10 on 10 performance in every which way. Yeah.
So, this phrase global south that has sort of suddenly become so popular, and it's perhaps the latest iteration of the non-aligned world, or the non-aligned 2.0. And I know that both of you will have differences with these phrases. And as our language changes over the decades in India's foreign policy, of course, these things also mean different things. But I do want to pick up on this phrase that India is now positioning itself as being a representative of the global south. But before I say that, I want to sort of come back to what Amitabh Kant said. And he said that, in these 200 hours of nonstop negotiations, and the draft after draft after draft, and I'm talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict paragraph. And then he basically brought the four Sherpas of Brazil, that's Mauricio of Brazil, Gianni of Indonesia, and Zain of South Africa. I hope I'm pronouncing the names right. And he was the fourth Sherpa. And then he says he roped in the Sherpas of Mexico, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So what these guys basically did was that they came together, put together a proposal, and told the Western Sherpas and Russia and China that, listen, we, the global south, are much more interested in issues like climate financing, restructuring global debt. So get your act together, get your war sorted out, because that's not the most important thing on the agenda. Ms. Motwani, what do you make of this?
Well, India is recognizing that it's at a historic moment right now. It's at a juncture where the global forces, the global, the way the geopolitics is shaping up, with US disentangling from China, it is a moment in history where I'm actually really surprised, Jyoti, that it grabbed this opportunity so well. Yeah. But it's recognizing that it has a window right now where it can appropriate the leadership of the global south, if nothing else, in terms of sheer population. So this is what I think is critical. But I also think that this is not just about the global south. I actually think that this is going to be shifting the conversation away from the post-World War II Bretton Woods institutions that the US and Europe put together.
You actually believe that it's shifting the conversation away from the Bretton Woods?
It's already happened. It's not new. It's happened. It is already, we are shifting. What we are going to see that's different now is we are going to see people like, Ajay Banga at World Bank and people at IMF putting together a different architecture of the way global lending is done, for example. Just the sheer notion of debt, of debt financing of the developing world for growth, as opposed to taking ownership, right, of part of some of the debt that China is funding for developing countries. It's actually appropriating entire ports and cities as the people as the countries default, as poor countries default on their debt. China is appropriating. So there's a new regime that India is putting in place, is about giving debt financing as a mechanism of growth and development. This is radical. This is very different, and it's going to have much larger amount of funding going into the developing nations compared to what the World Bank and IMF have done in the past.
So that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Can I just follow up on this? Are you saying then that the IMF and the World Bank, or the World Bank, and Ajay Banga was in Delhi for the G20, of course, we know, that they perhaps are going to offer an alternative model to what the Chinese have been doing in the global south, in countries like Africa especially, and Asia?
Absolutely, that's. I think that's there in the declaration, and I think Swasti is probably better equipped on this than me. But I think in the declaration, what we have mentioned about this corridor on the, I think it was on the sidelines perhaps, but what we have said about the corridor, the India Middle East Europe corridor, उसमें जो debt financing की बात कर रहे हैं, that is very different from what we have ever seen in the past. And I think IMF, World Bank, and the EU are completely bought into this whole US-India idea of redesigning the entire post-Bretton Woods institutional framework.
Do you agree with this, Dr. Rao, Dr. Swasti Rao?
Okay. Yeah. So I think the way I would look at it is that I think there's a realization in the global economic architecture, or the foundations of the global economic architecture, that it's not really working very well. And I think that really started when we saw Beijing really putting together this Beijing-style consensus to counter the Washington-style consensus, okay, right, of the structural adjustments. And I think that's what Ashaji was referring to about the IMF-style lending. And then Beijing came up with a completely new way of lending, and then they said that we are not really interested in human rights or any such issues, or your degree of democratization. If you agree to what we offer to you, and which is a lot of money, and then that's where it starts. And then slowly it really sounded very attractive, but then slowly it started to run into problems. But then that's one part of it, Jyoti. I think there is a healthy realization in the world today that the Washington-style consensus, the way it was conceptualized with the Bretton Woods, etc., the institutions, it needs reform. And I think what you see here is that the Western powers also, and especially the G7, also waking up to this reality. And I don't think that they have only risen up with India's G20 presidency. I think if you really go into the details of, for example, all these connectivity projects, for example, that the European Union is doing, or, for example, what Japan has been doing with several of these connectivity projects, and the way, they've been trying to restructure lending, etc. They have been trying to make more room, okay, for all these countries that are now sharing the high table thanks to India's diplomacy. So I think the better way to look at it, because I don't think that the Western institutions are going anywhere, but what is happening is that there was a decline. And the good thing is that, there are people who don't shy away from saying that these are the problems, and let's sit down together to counter these problems. Let's do this reform. So I think what we will have eventually is not, the going away of the Bretton Woods system. I think what we would have is a kind of a reformed Bretton Woods system with, of course, debt financing, etc. I think, you look at anything, all these things, we will keep hearing more on this. I mean, and why just G20? I mean, look at the BRICS, the new development banks of the BRICS. One of the reasons why so many countries wanted to join the new development bank was also because of its lending, right? Because it's committed itself to lending. So I think those things are going to be a part of it. And I think if you ask me, just the way I would like to conclude my point is that the global economic system is going to remain multipolar. And this is what I think the middle order powers are pushing for. And I think this is a very healthy thing to do, because you see, there are three systems, orders in the world. I mean, there's a global security order, there's a global economic order, and the global digital order. Of course, the global security order is dominated by the US. China is trying to challenge, but it's a different thing. The global economic order does not really belong to one camp. And I think what really needs to be done and understood is that through friendshoring, through strategies like friendshoring, how much of resilience are you able to build on the supply chains, and how much, multipolarity can you build there, so that's what is on table with all these connectivity projects, etc. So it's a work in progress. It's a reformed, form of, Western-led institutions. But yes, there will be a change. So the rules of the past will no longer apply to the problems of the present and future. And I think there is a widespread consensus on that.
But, having said that, I also would like to say here that, while you've very beautifully sort of demarcated the global security order from the global economic order to the digital order. But the fact remains that everything is politics. I mean, the global political order impacts on the economic order. So whether it's the Washington consensus or the Beijing consensus, and now we're talking about the New Delhi consensus, but, be that as it may. Listen, I'm not sure that the P5 or the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which is a result of what happened, after the Second World War, when the United Nations itself sort of was revamped. Now, are the P5 going to cede space to the voices of the developing world or of the global South. Dr. Giarija Motwani, what do you think? I mean, I'm a little more sort of circumspect about that, but I'd like to hear. You're sitting in New York, which is, in a month's time, everybody is going to congregate there.
So to put it simply, UN doesn't have a choice. It's a toothless institution that is fraying and probably going to be defunct very soon because 2 of its members are out of the loop now. Not only is Russia, completely boycotted from all of us here, but even China is something that we don't trust anymore. The US is, hands down in the middle of a Cold War. We may not say it so openly, but US is in the middle of a Cold War with Russia, with China. So I think, if you ask me, I mean, the word on the street in the US is that the UN is probably going to be kind of attenuating. I would probably in less than a decade. It will continue having peacekeeping operations, maybe refugee operations, and so on. But apart from that, it has never actually had any kind of economic muscle of any kind. But politically, it had the veto power, and even that is now going. So I would discount it heavily now. But what is going to take its place is not the G7, unless the US manages to bring in India as G8. If it does, that's a different story, and it might, just to make sure that it's staying in a gray zone before G20 becomes too powerful. But India definitely wants to lead G20, be its main anchoring power, and be calling the shots on economy, on global economics, on macroeconomics, and on foreign policy. And we are the best equipped for that. Because as China, Jyoti, I want to add one more point there. As China builds physical infrastructure in the world, guess who's building digital infrastructure of the planet? Mm-hmm. It's India. So we have...
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I'm sorry to pour cold water on... listen, we all as Indians would love India to be a power in the world, a power to reckon with. But I think we also have to be somewhat realistic about our ambitions and about ourselves as a nation. I mean, we are the 5th largest economy in the world, but in terms of per capita GDP, it's just over $2,000.
Jyoti, this is not about ambitions. This is about what's happening on the ground. Actually,
what's happening on the ground is also, if you talk to the African countries, and I'd like to bring in Dr. Rao here, the fact that the African Union became a member of the G20 on par with the European Union. I mean, I think that is fascinating. But Dr. Rao, talk to me a little bit about how is Africa looking at this? How is Africa, which is the recipient of large quantities of aid from China, how does Africa sort of manage both sides?
See, there is a lot of geopolitics behind it. There's a lot of strategic issues also behind it. One has to understand that Africa as a continent, if you remember, Africa for a long time, there were European powers who were colonial masters of so many African countries, etc. And in the recent years, you've seen that there's been a sharp decline, whether it's France's influence in Africa or whether it's the US being the major defense partner, etc. So all of that has been toppled over. And I think China has made these inroads into Africa. Russia has emerged as a major defense partner. And not just that, I think if you remember the Wagner equation out there, because that's where Yevgeny Prigozhin actually made his fortune, which was in Africa, Central African republics, etc. So I think what I have been noticing, I'm not going too far back into history, but what I've been noticing in my interactions with the Europeans and with all the work that I do, I see there is a lot of I would say tangible stress in Europe about this huge continent which holds the planet's 60% of renewable energy resources and 30% of crucial minerals, etc., and so much of cobalt, etc., in Congo. All of that slipping away in many ways. So I think you already had in place very ambitious connectivity projects between the European Union and Africa. You also see the European External Action Service, Jyoti, has been very serious about countering the rise of Wagner and countering all the disinformation campaign that you see. So they've allocated a lot of money for that. Now, of course, it depends about how it unfolds and all that. So it still remains to be seen. But this is what they did at the Human Security Forum when they're trying to put together a new European security security architecture, and they realize that it's not just Europe alone, but it's a kind of this outward policy that they have the world over, where there's economic security, there's fighting disinformation, etc., etc. So these are the newer components that Europe has been adding. So coming back to Africa, they already have these connectivity projects in place. And if you've gone through or if you've observed what von der Leyen has been saying about African Union joining the G20, I mean, she's welcomed it through and through, whether it's she or whoever, because the thing is that you can't really have this. I mean, you can't really ensure the success of all these connectivity projects when you're trying to compete, with a partner like China. And again, you have to understand that for Europe, China is a partner and a rival, not just a rival, and I think for everybody else as well. But then, so the thing is that what you do, so you have to alter and offer alternatives. So having the Africans on the G20 is a win-win situation for everybody. I mean, she has welcomed it through and through. In terms of optics, of course, it's a huge win, and I think that is what explains a lot of these emotional reactions that we saw from the African leaders. But I think if you look at it geopolitically, geostrategically, I think it's a very, very understandable thing. In fact, one would say that it's just so great that it happened at the time when India was holding the G20 presidency, because it would have had to happen anyway, sooner than later.
Xi Jinping may have welcomed the fact that the African Union has become a member of the G20. But I do want to say that actually Xi Jinping didn't have much option. It's because he didn't show up at the G20. I don't know why he didn't show up. He was there at the BRICS summit. He sent his premier Li Qiang. Now that could mean several things. The first is that he didn't think that he should, the emperor of China should show up at a nation that he believes is sort of lesser in some ways. But I think it boomeranged on him because, firstly, it was not as courteous as he should have been. And I think that the warmth that the Prime Minister displayed, I mean, he is a hugger. Let's be very clear. Prime Minister Modi likes to hug people. He likes to embrace people. Now, whether or not the world leaders like to be hugged and embraced, I don't know. But here, at least, in front of the wheel of the Konark Sun, the replica of the wheel of the Konark Sun Temple, which was so beautiful at the site of the G20 summit. But Ms. Jadeja Motwani, tell me a little bit about this body language and how does the world respond to that? This sort of Prime Minister Modi's embraces versus the Xi Jinping kind of cool and collected and his sort of very much more his demeanor, which is sort of much colder in a sense.
No, I mean, there's hands down overall, there is no doubt in my mind that Modi in the free world, in the democratic world, Modi is a hero. I mean, it's, in America, he's a hero. In Western Europe, he's a hero. People love him. People love his.
But why do they do that? I mean, why do you think that they are so fond of him?
Well, listen, this is like, let's take a look at, somebody like Golda Meir, or you even look at Indira Gandhi at some point. She was very appreciated in the West at some point before the emergency. But you have national leaders from various countries that have had, Anwar Sadat. People loved him, Egyptian premier who was shot dead. I mean, these are people who there is a certain charisma, a physical personality charisma that is there among certain global leaders. Modi has it. Let's face it, that's his trump card. Now, in terms of getting things done, it's of course his team that is getting things done, putting dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But when it comes to personal chemistry and charisma and the gift of the gab, it's actually Modi. When he speaks at the UN, you should just listen to the way his speech unfolds here. It's even if he's speaking in Hindi, this is standing ovations. There are people, and when he comes to the US, one of the things that Biden was talking about was that the phones in the walls in White House are ringing off the hook because everybody wants to meet him. And everybody is trying to get, into the... Is
that the Indian American community that is driving this?
Not really. No, I think there is a lot of, I think there is, first of all, the Indian American community is huge now, right? We are almost 7 million strong. If you count even the unaccounted for people, it's about 7 million from South Asia, I would say. Mm-hmm. So in this Indian community that we have, in the diaspora community, that of course is part of the momentum, which is a good thing, by the way, even for G20. And even in this whole movement towards getting White House to be opened up and to be warmed up towards India, a diaspora had a lot to do with it. So I think the the diaspora thing is strong, Jyoti, but it's not just that. It's the businesses in America that want in. It is the businesses that are dangling everything they can to get India to open up its regulatory environment, to make it less onerous, to make it easier for US businesses to come into India now and establish a footprint before others come. So there's a competitive element. We don't want the US, at least I don't want any of my companies. We don't want, Google doesn't want anything to come in, have competition there. It would rather be the first one in there. And it's spending and investing heavily in India right now. So, but the regulatory environment is still something that's a bit of a bottleneck for all of us here. And hopefully it will go down as India becomes a little bit more market friendly and less socialist in its orientation.
So, you use the word socialist in a negative way, I think. I would use the word Swadeshi, which is not a negative word actually, but is being used by several people in the BJP, in the RSS, as something, as like a protectionist sort of form of policy or of governance. So, Dr. Rao, can I ask you to come in here? You have these two very strong strands in the BJP. On the one hand, where you sort of a protectionist, you want to keep everything inside the country, be Indian, buy Indian. But then you have the G20 when India's on the world stage and you're welcoming foreign leaders. But when you welcome foreign leaders, you also welcome what they make. So can you make in the US and buy in India, or can you make in Europe and buy in India? How do you negotiate these two strands in India?
Okay, so there are two broad ways to understand this. Of course, from the most commonsensical understanding that there has to be a good balance, right? Everything is about striking the right balance of how much do you make in India, how much, of foreign trade do you enter into with other countries. That's a commonsensical thing. But I think if you ask me, and from the work that I do, I can definitely tell you that when it comes to, for example, defense, see, India is a country that is really obsessed with security, right? India is a very securitized country. So we have great relations with those that are our defense partners. So one has to understand that. So when you look at India geostrategically, or India's imagination of the world geostrategically, I think that the defense angle or the defense point really kind of becomes very important. So one thing is that when you look at the defense so to say ecosystem, yes, there is a very strong push by the government to try and make modern India and all that ideal of Atmanirbharta, because one has to understand with the kind of security challenges that we navigate, we can't be relying only on imports. It's a very, very well established fact now that we can't be relying only on imports. We have to get to our own capabilities. We have to, foster this ecosystem where we are able to do what we are able to come out with the technologies. We are able to do all the rest. But at the same time, if you look at the kind of challenges that we have and the in many ways the timing of the challenges, I think it is also important that we strike a balance and we get things that we don't have. For example, the submarines and for all of that, and the squadrons and the Air Force, all the fighters. So I think that is a balance that we need to make. The other thing about trade, especially in defense, is Jyoti, that India, there is a lot of focus on exporting arms made from India to other countries, and all this is a work in progress, because let's understand that we didn't really start. We've just started. It's just been a few years that it's kind of picked up steam. Mm-hmm. So for anything to show result, it'll take time. And just the other thing, let me, if you allow me another 30 seconds to complete. As far as economics is concerned, I think again, because, I completely agree with Asha ji here when she says that India has to really sort of liberalize in a way to make, to kind of step up the ease of doing business, because all this China plus one diversification that is happening in the world, there is a very, very well understood theme now that the world can't be decoupling from China. It is going to be very detrimental to global economy. But what you can do successfully is that you can de-risk from China and you can diversify. And because I focus on Europe, I mean, I can tell you exactly the 9-10 strategies that Europe has come out with. And the point that interests India is that can India really take benefit of that diversification and that diversifying. And the biggest problem, if you talk to the Europeans, is the ease of doing business. So
Right.
if we improve our all that environment, it is going to be very, very beneficial for India. And just the other thing is that when we are entering into all these free trade agreements that we are signing with countries, there has been a
Right.
history that the free trade agreements have not really been very good for our export surplus. But we should focus on those kind of agreements that actually land us into better export surplus.
Okay. Dr. Jadeja Motwani, now I just want to follow up on your previous comments about how the UN is becoming a toothless organization. And I'm just wondering, what is the value of the G20? Okay, now it's a G21 with the African Union on board as well. But while it's not by any chance or by any stretch of the imagination going to replace the UN, but should a larger multilateral body like this, which has all kinds of powers, which is interesting. You've got China, you've got Russia, you've got the US. So right now, some countries that are not particularly talking to each other, but they are together they sit together around one table. Should this be the model going forward, rather than an unwieldy United Nations, which is like 190 countries strong? Or on the other hand, could these complement each other? I mean, I know this sounds like a motherhood and apple pie kind of question, but I'm just wondering whether the minilateral, which is a phrase that is now becoming more and more popular, could replace this these multilateral G77 type organizations, for example.
Listen, I think it's the global sort of geopolitical realm is evolving right now. It's going to take many years before it settles down into some kind of a settled architecture that will enable decision making at a multilateral level, and who will be those G3 or G4 that Borge Brenga of the World Economic Forum keeps talking about. Borge's prediction that there's going to be a G3 that will determine the world order. I think it's a little bit premature thinking of US, India, and China as the G3. I actually don't think that China will be in that G3. I think the G3 will be US, India, and Europe. And why? Because it is democratic, because it's a free world, and it is in the process of actively establishing a new set of institutions for global flows of wealth and distribution and things like that. So I think in general, this is going to be a very different system that we will see. And I strongly recommend actually reading Dr. Jaishankar's book called The India Way. He is unbelievably astute about where he sees the world heading. And remember, he is one of the key, people involved in all of this. In fact, I think he might be on a flight right now to the US. Okay. And once he is here in Washington, D.C., the kind of things that he's wheeling and dealing, we Indians ought to be proud of. I really think that we are lucky to have it.
So this G3 that you're positing now, India, Europe, and the US, the fact remains, Dr. Rao, that we also have to be realistic, and China and Russia are not going away anytime soon. I mean, China is snapping at the heels of the Americans, which is why this whole nervousness is there in the first place, isn't it? The fact that the Chinese are becoming the keenest and the closest rivals of the Americans. So how do you sort of see this play itself out? And, we talked about very briefly earlier about the India-Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, which is going to sort of go through from Mumbai or Mundra, wherever, via Riyadh, via Dubai, Riyadh, and then onwards into Haifa, Israel. So you're touching Israel. You're connecting the Piraeus port in Greece and then onwards into Europe. Is that, do you think, is that being positioned as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative? Talk to me a little bit about why China and Russia are here to stay.
Okay, so just the first thing, I think India is, India is multi-aligning, right? And India has been vigorously multi-aligning, and it's been an issue-based multi-alignment, in the words of Dr. Jaishankar. And that's what has been hailed as the pragmatism of India's foreign policy, that we are at a moment where we have great relations with everybody. Now, having said that, Jyoti, it is important to realize, and here I agree with, Asha ji, that India's multi-alignment is not an equal distribution, and everybody has to understand that. So for India, Quad is not equal to SCO. So for India,
the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Yes, absolutely. And we do like to hold our optics of multi-alignment because, see, let's again face it. The fact is that multi-alignment is the reality for most of the middle order powers. So because we would like to play all sides. Right. And especially if you're talking about a country that does not have security treaties with anybody. I mean, we have rejected the alliance worldview for long. We have these two unsettled borders. So we try to sort of balance, everywhere. And then more specifically, we are also wary of an Asian order led by China. So one of the key foreign policy imperatives for India, apart from all this multi-aligning, is to basically make sure that Asia remains multipolar. Okay. Anyway, so coming back, so we will have this optics of multi-aligning and everything, but let's understand that India's multi-alignment is not an equal distribution. And with all the closeness that we've been seeing, all the strategic, cooperation that has been growing by leaps and bounds with the US, with the West, right, with the G7 particularly, also Japan there, right? It's quite unprecedented, and it's also unprecedented because of two things. One, that for the first time, it's really situated in a very solid quid pro quo. Okay, that the West understands that an empowered India in the Indo-Pacific is in their long-term interest, right? So it's not just arms giving, it's not just trying to sort of give away some deals to India. It is in their interest, and that is why I say that it's probably the first time that it's so much situated in a solid quid pro quo. Anyway, now coming back to this connectivity that you're talking about, yes, this particular thing is really, like I said, it has all the correct ingredients of a game changer because it has the right. I mean, it has from the US's perspective, it is a part of, I don't know how many people know it, but I'm sure Ashaji knows it. It's a part of this, this PGII, this partnership for, global investment and infrastructure that was basically announced at the G7 last year. And this particular thing, actually, a year before that, this was, I think, announced as the Build Back Better World by the Biden administration. And then they kind of reworked it and, kind of renamed it as the PGII. Okay. So from the US's perspective, this PGII, it is all about creating these infrastructural corridors, in the world. Right. They are doing it with the Latin American region. They are doing it with Africa, etc. And here is one that they are now doing with Middle East and Europe and all that. So quickly speaking, that yes, this is in many ways a kind of a game changer because see, for India, the only other way to get to that particular region was either the Chabahar port connectivity or the INSTC. Now with both these Chabahar and INSTC, Chabahar, of course, is Iran, and INSTC is again where we are there with Russia and Iran and all that. The problem is that it's so susceptible to geopolitical upheavals and sanction regime. So the one bright spot about the IMEC or the IMEC is that it is going to be free from all that kind of geopolitical, naughtiness. So it's not going to be as naughty as, there are not so many knots there. Okay. Yeah, that way. So it's not, that's one. The other thing is that its potential to grow. So the potential to grow is immense. In India, there are already talks about how we can include BeamSteak and all of that. And Japan is already there. So we might see Japan, joining it later. For Europe, it is interesting because it might just go and connect with the 3 Seas initiative. In Europe, there are these 3 important seas, the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Black Sea, and they already have a very elaborate connectivity, program. And and if you connect it with that, it really genuinely becomes a huge alternative to BRI. I mean, this is like bringing together. And if you look at the maths, a lot of people have done the maths just for Middle East and all the Europe and all that. I mean, it could perhaps be a jump of about 40% of in their earnings. So I mean, all of that remains to be seen because, like I said, that it's just started. The financial mechanism we don't know yet, right? I mean, it's about in 60 days' time they'll get. No,
I think the Saudis. I think the Saudis have already proposed that they are willing to spend $20 billion on this on this connectivity corridor. But Dr. Motwani, your last comments on this. And, the same question that I asked Dr. Rao just now, do you think that the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, do you think it is an alternative to the BRI, to China's Belt and Road Initiative? But what also interested me was that when this project was announced in the margins of the G20, Prime Minister Modi was flanked by Joe Biden, by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, as well as MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the the ruler of Abu Dhabi and the president of the UAE. So, what do you make of the fact that that you had these big boys of the Gulf sitting with Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi?
Well, what's really powerful is that it's in the self-interest of all these countries to put in place something that is an alternative to BRI. And it's happening already. It is, what it doesn't have right now is a serious commitment of funding. And I think that's where I feel that Europe needs to come in much more seriously. I think the Gulf will fund it. The US will be able to afford this in terms of geostrategic investment for its own interests. But Europe will have to make a bigger commitment. That's my last comment on this whole thing. But I think it's a very exciting corridor that's coming up, and there's no choice. I mean, we don't have a choice as a multipolar world right now. With this G3 arising, we really don't have a choice but to have an alternative to BRI.
Okay, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, but some really interesting thoughts in this discussion. You have the G3, something that I haven't heard of before, but I think we'll hear of it more and more in the weeks and months to come. Asha Jadeja Motwani in the US and Dr. Swasti Rao right here in New Delhi with me. Thank you so much for joining me at The Print on Bharat's World. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you.